Imagine handing your absolute worst enemy a state-of-the-art, $6 billion piece of technology. You don't just hand it to them. You literally force them to take it, and you charge them exactly $0. And the craziest part? You do this immediately after committing the exact same corporate crime you are loudly suing someone else for. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is exactly what Boeing did in one of the most spectacular, multi-billion-dollar corporate backfires in modern history. To understand how Boeing tried to outsmart the Canadian aerospace company Bombardier, and how it failed so miserably that it permanently altered the global aviation landscape, we have to look at the hypocrisy that started it all. In early 2016, United Airlines was shopping for a new fleet of jets. They were heavily courting Bombardier for their brand new, highly advanced CSeries aircraft. The CSeries was a marvel of modern engineering. It was a 100 to 150 seat jet that was incredibly fuel efficient, quiet, and beloved by pilots and passengers alike. Bombardier had bet the entire future of their company on this plane, sinking roughly $6 billion into its development. Boeing looked at the United Airlines negotiations and panicked. They could not allow a Canadian upstart to gain a foothold in a major United States legacy carrier. So, Boeing swooped in to kill the deal. They offered United a massive contract for current generation 737-700s, but they didn't win on the merits of the plane. They won by slashing the price to a level that shocked the industry. Boeing sold these jets, which had a list price of over $80 million, to United for roughly $22 to $23 million each. That is a staggering discount of over 70%. Industry analysts and pricing data widely considered this to be well below Boeing's actual cost of production. Boeing was willing to take a massive, unsustainable loss on dozens of aircraft just to starve Bombardier of a crucial customer. Boeing won the United contract. Bombardier was left bleeding cash. But Bombardier didn't give up. Shortly after the United heartbreak, Bombardier secured a lifeline, a massive order for up to 125 series jets from Delta Airlines. This is where Boeing's hypocrisy reached astronomical levels. Furious that Bombardier had secured a major U.S. airline after all, Boeing filed a petition with the United States Department of Commerce and the International Trade Commission. Boeing's accusation? They claimed Bombardier was dumping the CSeries into the U.S. market at below-cost prices, subsidized by the Canadian government, to unfairly kill the competition. Let that sink in. Boeing, who had just sold planes to United Airlines at a 70% discount, well below the cost of production, was now suing Bombardier for allegedly doing the exact same thing to Delta. Aerospace insiders watched in stunned disbelief at the glaring double standard. But the U.S. Department of Commerce took Boeing's side. In a shocking ruling, they slapped a preliminary 292% tariff on every Bombardier series jet imported into the United States. If Delta wanted a $30 million jet, they would have to pay the U.S. government nearly $90 million in taxes just to bring it into the country. Boeing executives likely popped champagne. They thought they had just regulated their competitor out of existence. But they had no idea of the geopolitical earthquake they had just triggered. Boeing's attack on Bombardier didn't just anger Canada. It ignited a massive diplomatic crisis with the United Kingdom. While Bombardier is a Canadian company, the highly advanced composite wings for the CSeries were not built in North America. They were manufactured in a massive facility in Belfast, Northern Ireland. This factory was the lifeblood of the local economy, employing over 4,000 people. It was one of the largest private sector employers in all of Northern Ireland. When the U.S. government announced that 292% tariff, it didn't just threaten Bombardier's bottom line. It threatened to instantly bankrupt the Belfast plant and put 4,000 people out of work. The British government was absolutely furious. UK Prime Minister Theresa May directly lobbied US President Donald Trump to intervene and stop Boeing. But it went much further than polite phone calls. The UK Defense Secretary took to the press and publicly warned Boeing that its behavior could jeopardize future military contracts with the United Kingdom. This was not an empty threat. At that exact moment, Boeing was bidding for incredibly lucrative defense contracts to supply the UK military with Apache attack helicopters and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. By trying to kill a civilian airliner, Boeing had managed to alienate two major G7 allied governments simultaneously, putting billions of dollars of their own defense revenue on the chopping block. Canada, in retaliation, immediately canceled a $5.2 billion contract to buy Boeing Super Hornet fighter jets. Boeing was bleeding international goodwill, but the worst was yet to come, because Boeing's aggression was about to hand the series directly to their ultimate rival, Airbus. There is a common misconception that Airbus had always wanted the series and was just waiting in the shadows like a vulture. The truth is much more ironic. Back in 2015, as the development costs for the series were spiraling out of control toward that $6 billion mark, Bombardier was desperate. They approached Airbus and proposed a partnership. Airbus took a long, hard look at the series program, evaluated the massive financial risks, and walked away. They explicitly rejected the offer, stating they wanted to focus their resources on their own A320neo program. Airbus didn't want the series, but then came Boeing. Boeing's 2017 tariff threat pushed Bombardier to the absolute brink of total corporate collapse. Bombardier couldn't sell planes in the U.S. Their cash reserves were burning, and bankruptcy was imminent. This sheer desperation allowed Airbus to return to the negotiating table 2 years after they had walked away. But this time, Airbus held all the cards. They dictated incredibly one-sided terms. Airbus agreed to take a 50.01% controlling stake in the series program. The price Airbus paid for a majority stake in a state-of-the-art $6 billion aircraft program? $0 upfront. Boeing's aggressive legal maneuvering literally forced Airbus to take a deal they had previously passed on, but under vastly superior financial conditions. And Airbus had a brilliant loophole to bypass Boeing's tariffs. Because Airbus already had a manufacturing footprint in the United States, they announced they would build a new assembly line for the series in Mobile, Alabama. Since the planes would be assembled on U.S. soil by U.S. workers, the import tariffs wouldn't apply. Boeing had tried to keep a competitor out of the U.S. market. Instead, they invited their biggest global rival to set up a brand new factory right in their own backyard. Now, it is important to ask, was Boeing entirely wrong about Bombardier? The answer is no. While Boeing's method of using U.S. domestic trade law was deeply flawed and ultimately backfired, their underlying claim that Bombardier was receiving heavy government subsidies was actually shared by others in the industry. Bombardier's true rival in the regional jet market wasn't Boeing. Boeing didn't even make a 100-seat jet. Bombardier's real rival was Brazil's Embraer. In early 2017, the Brazilian government filed a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization. Brazil argued that a $1 billion bailout from the Quebec provincial government, followed by a $372 million loan from the Canadian federal government, constituted illegal subsidies. Brazil claimed this state backing artificially lowered the price of the series, making it impossible for Embraer to compete fairly. This proves that the series was, in fact, heavily state-backed. Boeing's fatal error wasn't calling out the subsidies. It was the battlefield they chose. Instead of fighting it at the World Trade Organization like Brazil did, Boeing tried to weaponize U.S. domestic trade law over a market segment they didn't even compete in. Realizing they had just handed Airbus a massive victory, Boeing panicked again. They tried to counter the Airbus-Bombardier alliance by attempting to buy Embraer's commercial jet division. Boeing spent roughly $150 million setting up this retaliatory merger, only for the deal to spectacularly collapse in 2020, leaving Boeing with nothing but legal fees and wasted time. But what happened to Bombardier? Did they survive this ordeal to fight another day? The tragic reality is that the financial bleeding caused by the series development, compounded by the brutal dispute with Boeing, ultimately forced Bombardier to exit the commercial aviation industry entirely. Giving away half of the series to Airbus for nothing was just the beginning of the end. To stabilize their crushing mountain of debt, Bombardier had to initiate a fire sale of their entire commercial legacy. In 2018, they sold off their famous Q400 turboprop program to Longview Aviation Capital. In 2019, they sold their CRJ regional jet program to Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries for $550 million. Finally, in 2020, completely out of cash and options, Bombardier sold its remaining 33.5% stake in the series, now renamed the Airbus A220, to Airbus and the Quebec government for $591 million. Today, Airbus owns 75% of the A220 program, with the government of Quebec holding the rest. Bombardier, a company that was once the world's third-largest commercial aircraft manufacturer, no longer makes commercial airliners. They have been reduced to exclusively manufacturing private business jets, like the Challenger and Global series. When you look at the final tally, the scope of Boeing's miscalculation is almost hard to comprehend. By trying to crush a small Canadian plane, Boeing achieved the following. They handed Airbus, their fiercest rival, a multi-billion-dollar, next-generation aircraft program for absolutely $0. They lost a guaranteed $5.2 billion fighter jet contract with the Canadian military. They severely jeopardized their defense relations and lucrative military contracts with the United Kingdom. They permanently alienated Delta Airlines, one of the biggest buyers of commercial aircraft on the planet. They wasted $150 million on a failed, desperate retaliatory merger with Embraer. And finally, they allowed Airbus to establish a brand new manufacturing footprint on U.S. soil in Alabama, further entrenching their European rival in Boeing's own home turf. Boeing tried to use its massive corporate weight to bully a smaller competitor out of the sky. But through a mix of staggering hypocrisy, geopolitical blindness, and sheer hubris, Boeing didn't just fail to outsmart Bombardier. They engineered their own worst nightmare.